We're on. A year, 53 weeks, a year and a week. We're bringing our program to a close this morning, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm a little misty, realizing that this is the last.
All right. Well, I don't know. Maybe somebody will sing a little song called "Misty Eyed" for us. Well, I'll tell you. Being that it is the last conversation that we have concerning the chapters of Marx, of Kapital, I'd like to hold on a second. Maybe if I drink a little bit more caffeine, I'll finish waking up. I've been running around all morning and half asleep, half awake, but I think I'm starting to slow down and get my getting ready for my second wind. Okay, all right. Enough of the informalities. Let's do the hard academic, intellectual, imaginative stuff now.
Rigorous.
All right, cool. So we were 53 weeks into the book discussion, and today constitutes the last discussion that we have, and it will be concerning it'll be concerning section 4 of chapter 25, the title of which is the different forms of the relative surplus population and the general law of capitalistic accumulation. And what we'll do, Matt, is go over some of the stuff that is introduced in this particular chapter, in this particular section, and then I will provide a synthesis. Of course, between now and then, we'll engage in conversation. You provide commentary, you provide analysis as well, and then finally, what I'd like to do is maybe have a conversation about the ways in which the reading that we've done over the year has prepared us for the kind of work that we're hoping to do, looking to do in the time to come, informed as it is by the things that we've either learned or things that we've either cemented our understanding around, drawn as these things are from the various chapters of the book. Okay, I hope that wasn't too long-winded. I've got my notes here, so it's easy for me to, put these things together in my mind and continue with them. Matt, before we continue, is there anything that you'd like to share, either directly or indirectly related to the world of literary art production?
No, I mean, it's the same old, same old. I mean, it's going to be, it's one of these things where, working on poetry, you get quick results, and you get you get a lot of, you finish things quickly, and then you can share them with the world, and you get
yes, of course.
Start working on a novel. That's a lot of delayed gratification. So I'm still plugging away.
Okay, all right.
Still banging my head against the wall. So it's making progress, but it's
still going at the moment.
Well, it's a much bigger hill. It's a bigger hill. It's a bigger hill, and it's a bigger rock. So, that's where I'm at right now.
All right. Well, we're looking forward to its completion and looking forward to read it. All right. Perfect. Well, again, the title of the chapter is the different forms of the relative surplus population and the general law of capitalistic accumulation. What I'd like to do is I'd like to set the context for our discussion, and of course, this is going to require that that I go over perhaps something that we've discussed before, and I'd like your thoughts on it, if you would, please. If you could give me or you could give us some language around it, and it's a very basic thing, but still constitutes a very central, at least as far as my reading over the last year is concerned, constitutes a central understanding about the relationship between capital and labor. And that is that, frankly, and easy to understand, of course, is that as history progresses, there are breaks in history, moments in history where very important, very dramatic qualitative changes take place. And then, of course, these changes gear things up a notch, if you will. And these qualitative changes in history complicate the life and existence of labor, and augment and provide for the accumulation of capital, money, wealth, and value for the capitalist class. And so that as accumulation of capital increases for the capitalist class, so does the quality of life for labor drop for labor. Eventually, as is discussed in this book, there will be, moments of crisis in between these moments where there is an unrest and unsettling of the systems of production, but then a kind of stasis, a kind of, at least superficially, a kind of equilibrium, and maybe that's not the right word to use, but a kind of a normalcy, right, settles and presents itself, and in such a case that the laboring classes acclimate or are forced to acclimate to this settling, though the quality of their existence over the years, over time, is dramatically altered. I haven't drank my coffee this morning, so Matt, won't you help me put words together to illustrate and to explain this kind of context that I very roughly put to words at the moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, as capital accumulates, it accumulates into the hands. I mean, these are not just like ideas that just float around in the ether, right? These are individual people doing individual things. So as capital accumulates in the hands of individual capitalists, they are more able to control. They're more able to control that kind of that field of labor, that type of work, right? And when they can control that type of work, they can control the wages much more tightly.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these things are not just subject. I think one of the things we talked about was we talked again and again for various reasons about agricultural labor. But
Yeah.
it's really interesting to me is agricultural labor. I mean, some of this stuff is conditioned to the material world that exists outside of the pressures that exist outside just between the worker owner relationship. For instance, a crop that will just will die quickly, right, on the vine. That won't last long on the vine. Well, workers in like berry industries, some of that might get paid more than a worker, picking like I don't know, oranges or something like this. So something with a longer vine life. Depending upon that, if there's a particularly harsh winter or something like this, if there's a particularly where, then the cost of labor could go up. But when you have systems wherein the capitals can basically consolidate, kind of monopolize, then they're able to control what wages will be paid. So, for instance, Walmart, has a giant. It's not competitive. I mean, there's so many. They have so many. They can really kind of control the price of what they're going to pay their workers, because it's not really like there's so many people that need work, and they have so much control over this, and that they don't have, like, obviously there's Target and those other places, but they don't really have the kind of the competition. Amazon, for instance. So all these giant corporations are able to really control what they pay their workers, whereas something like Facebook or Google or some of these other things, they have to pay their workers, the people that write the code and do the algorithm and all the kinds of things that make Google run and make Facebook run. These people are still workers, and because they have, because essentially they're selling their labor
Yeah.
to live. But that skill is kind of rarefied. That skill is kind of, um, there's not a lot of people that can do it. They need a certain amount, and so these people are paid a king's ransom to do this work in order to keep the company going. And even still, Google, Facebook, all these people, they're looking for ways to cheapen the labor force by bringing in bringing in workers from other countries but they still pay them a king's ransom. They still pay them a lot of money, because there's really no way around just how rarefied a skill that is, and just how needed now the nature is of these tech corporations. I mean, they're constantly competing with each other to have the newest features, the newest this, the newest that, and so there's a real quick rate that they need these workers. So those workers can charge a lot of money for what they do. I mean, this is the difference between what they call skilled and unskilled labor, but the fact remains. I mean, the fact that the time, the nature of the market, the nature of the work, it's a little harder to do these things. So, but I don't want to compare tech workers to that's getting to that weird kind of that weird textbook Marxian kind of stuff that's totally divorced from the real world, right? I mean, these people paid very, very well.
Yeah.
They're not going to be the vanguard. They're not going to be the vanguard. They're not going to be the ones carrying pitchforks. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, for example, just giving an example there. But like even in agricultural work, I mean, again, if there's a particular crop that's going to die quickly in the vine, that the workers there have a greater command of have a greater leverage
Yeah.
than
Assuming, of course, that the crop, the agricultural commodity, the agricultural product hasn't been doctored some way such that industry, such that capital can monopolize even its growing cycle, even its life on the vine, even its life on the shelf, right?
Yeah.
That capitalist technology is constantly penetrating the systems of production, the means of production, or I'm sorry, the methods of production, to ensure, right, that it monopolizes production as much as possible throughout the
Right.
cycle.
So this is an interesting thing you're talking about right now, right? So that, I mean, that in and of itself, I mean, it shows usually how chaotic the system really is, though. Because take, for instance, you're talking about pesticides and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So if you look at like what was going on a few years ago, it's probably still going on today. I mean, but the struggle against it was at a high point probably a few years ago. What was going on in India with Monsanto and bringing in the Terminator seeds, right? These seeds that could like grow one crop and they would not develop another seed, so the farmer could not do it. This kind of very proprietary GMO
Yeah.
type of thing was going on there. That that was devastating to the workers. But if you think about it, there are industries that are dependent upon import export, right? That are dependent upon the importation of certain food crops from different parts of the world, and they make their money skimming off the top of that. But then there are other groups of people who make their money off of having certain pesticides.
Yeah.
So in a way, these are competing interests, because this is actually preventing the amount of foodstuffs coming in. So this is how chaotic how chaotic and irrational the capitalist system is. So some people are like, well, they wouldn't endanger this and they wouldn't cause famine. There's no money in a famine. There's no money in this. There's no money in that. Well, certain industries aren't going to make money in that, but other industries will. So that's really how we have to look at this. I mean, this system. When we talk about capitalism, it destroys the earth. It destroys the soil. I mean,
Yeah.
it destroys the air above us. It destroys the ground beneath us. It destroys the rivers and the lakes, the water that we drink. It destroys the air that we breathe. It destroys all these things. And and you can say, well, maybe that's industry, and that's not really the owner worker. Well, of course, but under capital, industry must move forward no matter what. If we had a socialist type system, if we had socialism, or we had global communism, then we could stop using these things, because obviously they're destroying the earth, they're destroying the sky above us, they're destroying the ground beneath us, they're destroying the rivers and lakes. and we can do something else. But because there are so many competing interests in the capitalist system, these things can never be resolved. They're never going to stop poisoning the ocean because there's just too much money in poisoning the ocean. And say, well, what about well these fishermen are losing money because of poisoning the ocean. Well, the fishermen aren't as big as ExxonMobil, so they're not going to be able to prevent. They're not going to be a Bubba Gum Shrimp is nowhere near the size of Capital as British Petroleum. So it's just not going to happen. And so this is the kind of thing that we really have to understand. I mean, the accumulation of capital. I mean, it tends. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest corporations that are out there, they're not going to stop doing what they're going to do. Yeah.
I'm reminded of a presentation that the now he's no longer president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, but during his time in the presidency, it must have been about 10, 15 years ago. It must have been about 15 years ago that he becomes president. 2006, I think. In fact, it was 15 years ago that he becomes president. And then sometime shortly after that, and this is really what begins to a declaration that he makes, a statement that he makes at some summit, of left-leaning governments of South America. He declares, and I forget the actual language, but essentially he declares that his government is going to protect Mother Earth, Pachamama, and one of in this particular declaration at this particular summit, he makes a statement that frankly I hadn't heard up to that point, at least stated in such clear manner. He said that that the capitalist system is deliberately and effectively a generator of death and destruction. And I hadn't really, I understood it. Those words made a lot of sense to me at the time because of the things that I'd been involved with or things that I'd been informed about up until then. But I had never really given my attention to the mode of production, that is the capitalist system in and of itself, as the automaton, if you will, as Marx states in one of the chapters that we read, that is the instigator, the engine, the prime mover of this destruction. Anyway, that statement made me think a lot about things that I've been doing over the last 10 years or so. And of course, it's, contributed to the work that we've done over this year. In any case, what's
interesting to me is reading this chapter, though, the thing that stood out to me. I'm sorry, did you want to finish that?
Well, go ahead. I'll listen. Go ahead, go for it. There's something I do want to share, but go ahead, go for it.
But okay, so in reading this chapter, I mean, like, it's really interesting, like, later, years later, probably the most significant Marxist after Marx. I mean, that was just an intellectual, not necessarily like somebody going out and doing shit like Lenin or Mao, but like somebody that was like actually like and just sitting around writing and thinking. Probably like Wallerstein, when he had the kind of world system concept. But world systems is just a really polite way of saying colonialism. I mean, it's really just like, what are we talking about here? What are we really talking about? And so it's really interesting reading this, though, because I'm reading this and it says, like, the repeal of corn laws gave a marvelous impulse to English agriculture. Drainage of the most extensive sale, new methods of stall feeding. So this is kind of interesting because this is what we're talking about just now. Drainage on the most extensive scale, new methods of stall feeding, and the artificial cultivation of green crops, introduction of mechanical manuring apparatus, nutrient increased use of mineral manures, employment of steam engine, and all kinds of machinery, more intensive cultivation generally characterized this epoch, right? So they changed the law, and so then when they changed the law, the way in which corn was grown in England changed. At the same time, under this area of cultivation increased from 1846 to 1856 by 4,644, 119 acres, without reckoning the great area in eastern counties which had transformed from rabbit warrens and poor pastures into magnificent cornfields. Now, what's so interesting to me
Mm.
here, and I don't want to be a hater, but here's a kind of a failure of Marx in that he just naturalizes the growth of corn in England. That corn's not from England.
Mm.
Corn's not from England, and this is not to shit on the corn growers of England at the time, who again struggling and trying to make a better life for themselves and blah 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 blah. I'm not to say that. What it is to say is though that the class struggle that had took place in imperial countries is set forth by imperial plunder. Even what you struggle over, the things that you struggle over, exist because of imperialism. All class struggle in the capitalist epoch, in the capitalist era that takes place, exists because of imperialism, even within the imperial core. Class struggle in the countries that are being imperialized, that are being colonized, takes place. It takes on two characters. It takes on the character of a struggle for national liberation, but also a struggle for against workers and owners, right? So those two things kind of like contend, and oftentimes we see them clash, right? So there's people that want to get rid of the colonizer, but they also want to live off the backs of others, right? So they're not opposed to living off the backs of others. They're opposed to some foreigner living off their backs and living off the people's backs, right? And they may have genuine feelings of national disgust of somebody from somewhere else controlling their lives, and they may have that may be totally sincere, but they have no issue with the idea that like if you own, you own, and some people are meant to own and some people are meant to work and get back to work, and I'm going to get back to my big grand thoughts about what a republic should be and blah blah blah. So they may have genuine hatred of the imperialists, but they themselves want to replace.
They want to be the monopolizers.
They want to monopolize exploitation.
Well, they want to be the capitalists.
They want to be the capitalists, yeah.
They want to be the capitalists,
right, know. So there's that. But even within the imperial countries, where they fight and they struggle over these different things, they struggle over these things that only exist. I mean, like, and I don't mean to sound like one of these kind of like odd people who are saying things that are that crap on class struggle wherever it may take place, and just be like, well, you really need to be organized. I'm just saying this is just true. What to make of it and what to advocate from there on out are open questions. But the truth of the matter is, even let's take the workers at Amazon that are on strike right now or fighting for whatever. The reason Amazon is such a huge corporation is because the world economy relies on sweatshop labor. That's why Amazon is huge. Amazon is huge because products are made all over the world for a pittance. Yeah. That's why that's what the world economy, that is what the world of commodities is built on. And Amazon steps into that world, a world of commodities, produces no commodities, but steps into a world. Well, they get the Amazon Prime now, but for the most part, is a retailer of commodities. But these commodities are made at a pittance, and that's why Amazon can exist, and can exist for those reasons. And so people that work at Amazon work at a company that only exists because of the exploitation of people all over the world. And so their struggle is still defined by that, similar to the corn farmer in England who is struggling against the English capitalist who was trying to crush them and monopolize and do all these kinds of things. They are and proletarize them and send them into the factory, etc. They are themselves struggling over something that only exists because of European imperialism into the Americas. Yeah. And that's just true. That's just true. Now, does that say that the English proletariat shouldn't struggle against the capitalists? That they should, flagellate themselves and kick themselves in the ass and be like, I'm evil too, and I'm a part of this, and therefore I should do nothing? Of course not. Of course they should struggle. And of course they should fight. Of course the Amazon workers should fight for their rights. Of course all these things should happen. But it all takes place within this broader thing where class struggle is defined by the colonial architecture of the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, earlier we were having a conversation, and I want to get back to something that we were discussing just a few moments ago, and then maybe we can bring it back to this very last statement about the architecture of capitalist economy, the architecture of the world economy.
Oops, sorry.
Yeah, there's a statement that, of course, is repeated in different ways throughout the book. But this culminating chapter in our particular discussion today gives us an opportunity to repeat it and to remind folks of one of the central theses in this particular book. And of course, it concerns the capacity to not just to commoditize labor, but to fit and integrate labor as a part of the methods and means of production. And Marx put it again in this particular chapter in this particular way. And I'd like to share it. Gives us an opportunity then to also talk about how it is that human beings, commoditized as they are, human beings commoditized as labor, right, are effectively within the capitalist system an apparatus, an extension, armature of the economy. And Marx put it this way: this law in the capitalist society where the labor does not employ the means where this law in a capitalist society, where the laborer does not employ the means of production, but the means of production employ the laborer, undergoes a complete inversion and is expressed thus: the higher the productiveness of labor, the greater is the pressure of the laborers on the means of employment. The more precarious, therefore, becomes their condition of existence vis-a-vis the sale of their own labor power for the increasing of another's wealth, or for the self-expansion of capital. So that as a laboring class, not only are they a commodity, in fact, not only are they armature of the economic system, not only are they the armature and the apparatuses, or the apparatuses of the world economic system, the world economic architecture, etc., as you put it just a few moments ago, but indeed, and of course this is a central thesis, if not the main thesis of the work that we've been reading, right? They're commoditized so that they can augment and participate in the accumulation of surplus value and wealth and profit for the capitalist class. I wonder how we might then think about workers, the laboring classes. We can think about them then as part of this architecture. I'm reminded, for instance, of something as you were talking just a few moments ago about the ways in which commodities produced as a pittance, be that in Singapore, be that in Brazil, be that wherever it is that commodities are produced as a pittance, they make their way to distribution centers in Southern California, and then they are delivered from these distribution centers to different sub-distribution centers, and then from there to the different neighborhoods. That is to say that supervision and control and a monopolization, not just the production itself, but a monopolization of the channels of distribution, right, are exercised, or rather a monopolization of these channels is also exercised to ensure that the cost to capital is kept at a minimum, right, and that the profits available to capital are kept at a maximum. Therein is it that the capitalist class, commoditizes human beings. Therein is it that the capitalist class ensures that, we function, those of us who are not part of the capitalist class, that we function in line with its keeping, in line with its objectives. Now, if we're talking about the capitalist class, if we're talking about laboring classes, then every segment of labor within these channels, be that from the extraction of the natural resources to the production of the commodity, and then to the delivery of these commodities to the different points of consumption, has a particular function. And of course, Marx is writing about, in this particular section, he's talking about the pauper class, he's talking about the vagabond class, he's talking about, those partially employed or those wholly unemployed, that they too have a task, that they too have a function in this system of production and consumption and distribution, such that those partially employed or those wholly unemployed have a task, and it's an integral and necessary task to keep the system going. And I'm interested in this because, of course, currently there are orphans and pauper children making their way to the United States, and certainly they are the inheritors of America. Certainly they are indigenous to America. Certainly they are on trails and paths that are, thousands of years old. And yet, colonized as we are in America, they fit within the kind of imperial plan that you were talking about earlier, be that the imperial plan as far as corn is concerned, or the imperial plan as far as, native people of America are concerned. Anyway.
What's fascinating me about with this topic, though, is that when people discuss this in the United States, and when they express concern, and when they express feelings of that there's an great injustice going down, they talk about immigrants' rights. They talk about the immigrants. They talk about kids in cages. And they talk about, when you get the kids out of the cages, and these are positive impulses, but there's such a lack of specificity that takes place when talking about these things. Because in the United States of America, if you talk about immigrants, the immigrants, like, who comes to mind? Who comes to mind?
Mexican
Unless you specify Haitian immigrants, Cambodian immigrants, whatever. Generally speaking, the mind runs to where? Runs to Mexico and Central America. You talk about kids in cages. I mean, who are these people? So it's really this really bizarre thing, where in the United States of America, when you talk about these populations, you broaden it to whatever. You don't talk about the specific nationality. You don't talk about the specific whatever. You don't get into the history of the fact that these people have heritage, and these people have not heritage, and they are the descendants of the at least mostly the descendants of the original peoples of this hemisphere. And that is just not talked about. That is not discussed, because when it comes down to it, like, if you're going to talk about, well, what should be done, what's the right thing to do, it comes down to a question of land. And that question can't happen. There cannot. I mean, we can talk about this. We can talk about a lot of things, but we cannot talk about. We can talk about hate crimes. We can talk about some type of reparations, the word, but not reparations, but like
amnesty,
or some type of cash payments of some sort, or some sort of getting people on their feet. You can talk about those things, right? But when you get down to the bottom, when you really start examining the nature of the struggle, the nature of the history of these issues, the history of these problems, right? You start getting into the United States and its role in Central America. You start getting to the United States and its role in Mexico, and then you get these there's different histories. But then it goes back even further. It goes back further and further and further, and then it takes you all the way back to Columbus. It takes you back to Pizarro. It takes you back to Cortez, and all of a sudden the question begins to broaden. The question really begins to broaden. Like, oh, wait a minute. We are dealing with the question there is really question over land and ownership and right and whatever. And they can't have those conversations. They can't have that conversation because that it becomes like an existential kind of threat. And so that's why I feel that's why the question is always very vague. You talk about immigrants, you talk about kids in cages, and you don't say like, well, which kids? Immigrants from where? What are we
Yeah,
talking about here?
yeah,
Borders? Which borders? What are we talking about? And they don't want to. They don't want to have those conversations. They don't have conversations. And I feel like a lot of our intelligentsia doesn't want to have the conversation either, because they start broadening it and expanding it and finding all these like weird things, and in some ways end up reifying the Spanish casta system, being like, well, that's not really indigenous, and this is not really that, and it's not really that, and is this really that, or are we really being this, and what about that? And they start like getting into like these really weird things, and not just like looking at what the general pattern is. They get bogged down in these really specific case things that disproves the general reality, because no one wants to have this conversation, and no one really wants to have this conflict, because this conflict is an existential conflict that if you really are serious about it, it's going to call towards actions that are going to you know lead to a conflict that's not pretty.
yeah, yeah.
So it must be avoided at all costs.
Yeah, it's um, so certainly the economic system would stay in place. I mean, you can, I mean, at least theoretically, uh, you can free children from cages
Mhm.
and continue to have the economic system um, maybe not working as profitably as before, but certainly, like if tomorrow the cages were opened and children left. In
Mhm.
fact, if tomorrow the cages were open, children were reunited with their families, either here in the United States or wherever it is, um, you know, that they'd be reunited. The economic system would still stay in place.
Mhm.
And so that's a discussion. That's a discussion that's on the, however far off on the side of the table it exists, right? That's a discussion uh, that's more plausible, that's more possible. That's a discussion that might be pursued. And within that context, of course, is a discussion of amnesty, right? Uh, is a discussion of some kind of retribution, right? But the greater and more historical discussion, to which you are alluding, that's a more complicated one, um, and certainly complicated theoretically, and worlds more complicated at the practical level. Absolutely. But the fact of the matter is, brown children and the descendants of brown America are
Mhm.
in cages,
Yeah.
are kidnapped, as they have been for 500 years in different ways, be that in the mission system, be that in, early forms of um, the carceral system in the state of California, for instance, be that in these, kidnapping centers called reservation schools, uh, you know, wherever. I mean, people are indigenous people are continually contained. Indigenous people are continually confined, and they are exploited, and their, justification is made for, the theft of their land, be that in Chiapas in the 1990s, the theft of their land in central Mexico today, in the states of Guerrero, in the states of Michoacan, be that in the theft of their land in Central America, in Honduras, be in Guatemala, etc. Um, we're talking about indigenous people, again, contained and confined for their exploitation, such that their land and its resources can be extracted and make its way into our morning cup of tea or our morning cup of coffee. You know, that's what that's about. Or, you know, the gold around our necks, you know, or the minerals in our cell phones, etc. Absolutely. And that's the discussion, you know, that this book helps us to understand as well.
Yeah, so I mean, like, absolutely. And getting back to, you know, the commodities, goes back to the point earlier. It's just that, you know, even, you know, Marx was describing the corn laws that got passed in England, but it's just, again, the fact that corn is grown in England, the fact that he talks about these fields that were once, he said, called them rabbit warrens, right? So just like a field, just, you know, rabbits just living their lives, is now this like incredibly profitable field of corn. But and then, you know, there's a struggle over that corn between capitalists and between those who are working the land and those who own the land, right? And, you know, of course, you know, weigh in with the workers. You hope they win their struggle. But my point, generally speaking, though, is that corn is grown in England because Spaniards murdered indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere and did business with the English, you know, who later themselves came and by this time had been murdering indigenous people as well.
Yeah.
For years at this point, for centuries at this point. But like, that is why there is corn in England.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we are, we're essentially, you know, there's a few sections that we're not going to discuss because they constitute, there's 2 or 3 sections left in chapter 25 that we're not going to discuss because they constitute the empirical evidence, more empirical evidence, you know, to substantiate the theoretical claims that are made in this particular chapter, and then even other chapters of the book. So we're essentially at the tail end. In fact, today constitutes the last day that we meet to talk about Kapital and its, you know, theoretical themes. And certainly, as you mentioned, you know, the book is useful to understand the agricultural economy in 19th century England, and for that matter, the agricultural economy in 20th century, in the US in the 20th century. Indeed, the agricultural economy, the mineral extractive economy in Latin America in the 21st century. What do you see us doing, addressing, what do you see us discussing in ways that are relevant to the folks that, you know, have been following us over the course of the year, and other folks that, you know, we'd like to inform? What do you see us doing as far as, and reading about and discussing as far as the work that, and the understandings that we've either you know, made for ourselves or cemented for ourselves over this last year?
Well, I think that I want to keep going. I want to keep going. Maybe not once a week, but maybe, like, let's say once a month or something
Sure,
like that.
sure.
Promote it that way. And what I'd be interested in is, I know that Marx and Capital, particularly this book Capital, is so full of language that has either fallen out of use or was very, very specific to the talking circles that Marx was in, to the talking circles he himself, you know, dominated with the terminology he was using. So in many ways, it is dominated by a jargon that has either fallen out of favor or is kind of locked into its talking circles.
Yeah.
I really want to pull it out of that, because there's a lot here that, once you kind of understand what he means by things, that there's a connective logic that is very useful to just understanding anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would propose, or what I would be very interested in, is continuing to have these discussions and bringing in the problems of our day, the troubles of our day, and to show that whatever these problems may be, social, cultural, political, they have an economic root, you know, and identifying that economic root and bringing on people who might have an expertise in certain type of things, and then us trying to like identify, okay, well, what is the economic root of these things? At the end of the day, how do we, as they say, follow the money,
Yeah.
right? And that would be my interest in continuing these discussions.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. One of the things that um, for me is very interesting, and maybe some folks know that I'm interested in. It's a deep personal interest of mine is the question of biographies, right? And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is in order to underscore and underline the relevance of this book and its contents, is I'm really interested in following up with a um, a suggestion, more than a suggestion, an urging that I received about 35 years ago from, I think it was either, I don't remember if it was Ana Castillo or Sandra Cisneros. And of course, she wasn't speaking to me individually, but I attended a talk. Some 35 years ago, and it was a small gathering of Chicano students, Chicana and Chicano students, and she was conducting a presentation for us. And she said something that has either Ana Castillo or Sandra Cisneros, I don't remember at the moment. She said something, one of these authors said something to us that's always stuck in my mind. I've never abandoned it. I've always kept it close to heart, close to mind and close to heart. That is that every person has a story to tell, and you know, and our stories, of course, are linked as much to history more generally as they are to the neighborhoods and neighbors and the family members that in which our lives are enmeshed, with whom our lives are enmeshed. So that thought has always been on my mind, and of course, I've always thought about this then in relation to thought about my life, and I've thought about the lives of other Chicana and Chicano people specifically, and thought about the lives of other Latin American origin people more generally, in line with the central historical junctures of the 20th century, which are the post-war period, following World War II, of course, and then specifically, as far as that is concerned, thinking about the Bracero program as being one of these channels in which we were filtered as labor, one of these channels in which Mexican origin people were filtered and brought into the United States as commodities, as the apertures and as the armatures, as the gears for the agricultural economy of the mid 20th century, and then of course leading into, well, to the very present period. So that's one thing that I'm really interested in getting us to possibly engage folks in conversation about this a moment. Then of course there's another moment in history that serves as a very important juncture, a very important qualitative break in history, and that's the late 70s and early 80s. And it's important, of course, because that moment constitutes an economic collapse of the Mexican economy, and at the same time constitutes a very important moment in Latin America more generally, because of course it is that period, late 70s, early 80s, when there is an increased proportion of Central American origin people to urban centers in the United States, where Mexican people and Chicano people had already had, a decades-long presence. And of course, I'm thinking at this moment of San Francisco and LA, right? So these are for Central American destination. So I'm interested then, as far as these qualitative breaks, and then of course another one being the the establishment and the imposition of North American Free Trade Agreement in Mexico in the mid-90s, and that also serves as an expulsion of Mexican people from the countryside and their presence as commodity, as labor in urban centers in Mexico and urban centers in the United States, as you know, as part of this relative surplus population. In any case, I'm really interested in the possibility of engaging folks in discussions about their lives such that we can make connections between, you know, the life of a person looking for work today, you know, or the
Yeah.
life of a worker today, to not just to history that we know about as native people to America, but also to the history of this economic system that has been imposed on America. And so I'm really interested in that possibility. And I hate to be so long-winded about this, but I'm really interested in the possibility that we might have, you know, to have such conversations with people, you know, to amplify and to I don't know if complicate is the right word, but anyway, to have a more variegated understanding, you know, of our indigeneity as part of an imperial project, as part of a colonial project, about which, you know, Marx was also writing, you know, of course, from his perspective, you know, from his side of the equation, you know, in the world population. Of course, I'm talking about, you know, 19th century Europe, you know, so that his vantage was that vantage. Important as it was that vantage. Your thoughts, Matt?
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's his advantage. I mean, our advantage is our advantage. Our advantage is the vantage of people who, I mean, everything you describe is accurate, but then also, like, we live in the United States of America.
Yeah.
So our advantage is be different than the people that, you know, living in Mexico, living in El Salvador, living in Guatemala. I mean, our vantage point is still very different. And, you know, so these things that we make, these grand proclamations we might make, might seem
yeah.
to people living in different circumstances. So, I mean, like, that you know, that too is true. So, like, I'd be very interested in doing it. I'd be very interested in doing it. Very interested in examining this kind of these kind of things and trying to identify things that I mean, independent about what you think about how they should be, independent of like what you think, like, okay, therefore this should be done, to really to identify the situation. I think that's the first step, to really identify what is actually happening. And I don't know if people have really. I think this would be a worthwhile project and something that, you know, we've devoted a year to. So I don't see any reason to stop. I mean, I see a reason. I mean, I know that, you know, maybe this pace is you know has been difficult, and maybe down a bit might be a relief in some respects, but I don't see any reason to stop. And I think that bringing on a guest with a month to talk about a very specific topic. And again, I mean, my interest is always you're talking about some very specific things and looking at the rooting in the very specific history there. But I'm interested always just in how do we identify these problems that exist in the world, and how do we find the economic root of these issues? You know what I'm saying? Because I mean, people get really upset, and when you kind of do this kind of when you start talking about, well, what about class? What about class? What about class? Because that usually just means like, fuck what you're talking about. Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about some other group of people who are workers, and usually white people. But you know, or it could be done for any number of reasons, right? I don't want to talk about what you're talking about. I want to talk about this. I want to talk about a different group of people. That's when the question of class is usually brought up. It's like, I don't want to talk about this issue you're talking about. It makes me feel bad for a certain reason, and I want to talk about my problems. What about class? I'm a worker. Class, right? That's usually why and how it's done. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like identifying the problems that somebody's talking about and examining what in this problem has an economic root. How does what you're describing fit into the world economy? You know, because it does. It's not going to escape the world economy. Nothing escapes the world economy. You know, what is the economy? The economy is how you feed yourself. The economy is how you feed yourself and how you're exploited, and how
Yeah,
other people are feeding themselves off because of the way that you live.
yeah,
You know, and so like, how do we identify the thing you're talking about, whatever it is, not changing the topic, not changing the subject, but find out what is the economic root of your problem that you're describing to us. That's what I'm really interested in doing, and I'm interested in taking that around the world if possible. I mean, of course, I'm most interested in talking about these issues that we're talking right now about, you know, Chicanos, talking about Central Americans, talking about these people, talking about, you know, La Raza, whatever. I'm most interested in that. Of course, I'm naturally. That is nothing wrong with that. I have no shame in saying that. I have no, I have, I cannot be shamed for saying it. Of course, that's what I'm most interested in, most immediately interested in. But you know, I'm also interested in taking this global, taking it all
yeah,
over the world, and
absolutely.
applying that same lens.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, you know, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to make the seemingly abstract, jargonistic, if you will, uh, uh, esoteric, at least some people think it is, language of the book that we've just finished reading, uh, to make it real and to make it relevant in ways that are specific, you know, uh, to these groups of people that generally fit within particular sectors of the labor economy. You know, there's a reason why Mexican people were brought, you know, to the Central Valley. Uh, you know, there's a reason why Mexican people were imported as labor for their labor power to South Texas to pick cotton. You know, there's a reason why they were brought, and for that matter, there's a reason why Filipino people, about whom we really haven't spoken, you know, of course, it's outside the scope of our discussion, but there's a reason why you know, to kind of to illustrate the significance of what I'm talking about, you know, that there's a reason why particular sectors of society, the world society, are commodified as they are, and then inserted in a particular industry or set of industries, you know, such that commodity production is controlled, um, commodity distribution is controlled, and even commodity consumption and the consumer herself, the consumer himself, right? The identity of the consumer, the identity of that person is itself controlled so that, you know, the extraction of profit, the extraction of value from the seed on the ground all the way back to wherever it is that, you know, its reproductions are dumped, you know, so that all that can be, you know, extracted for profit all along the way. You know, and if we examine our lives and the lives of our neighbors, you know, we can understand that. You know, that's my thing. Anyway, Matt, um, some poetic closure uh, this morning.
You know, I didn't have anything prepared, so I mean, I will close with this poem. And it is dedicated to, you know, the lives of our neighbors. You know, may we study them well. That's it.
Okay, all right.
The lives of our neighbors. That's a beautiful close. It's been a year and a week, and I'm sure I will come up with something along those lines and write something about that. But you know, I hate to just say goodbye and that, not commemorate this somehow. This has been an incredible thing. I really appreciate your dedication and the time you devoted to this. And
Al
thank you.
contrario, señor. Al contrario, I appreciate. I've been very lucky. I've been very lucky generally, you know, and specifically, I've been very lucky to have found myself in conversation with you about this book and about things that matter to me. And so, you know, I hope that my luck and my enthusiasm is, been distributed by way of our conversations. There's a quote that I was hoping to come across in this book, but it must be somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And Marx writes somewhere, or might have been Engels. I can never, and I've looked it up, and I've never been able to find it. Something about the value of a person can be measured on the basis of who that person's friends and associates are. And I'm not doing that quote any justice, but I think I've at least the particular language of the particular quote that I'm thinking about. But essentially, I am more valuable as a person because people like you, Matt, are the people with whom the people by whom I am informed, the people by whom I am made more valuable. I'm not going to get all misty-eyed or nothing.
Speaking of farewells, though, I want to thank, there's a couple people I want to thank. I want to thank Zahn for showing up all the time in his commentary. I want to thank Garai for showing up with his commentary. I mean, these are people that have shown up almost every week. I want to thank Dust James for showing up nearly every week and for all the tremendous shares he has done. And I want to thank Karina for the same, and I want to thank Karina for all the work she did to help kind of almost a third member of the team to make the flyers every week. And this is like 40 some odd flyers.
All different colors, I think.
All different colors. Exactly. So
I didn't think there were that many different colors in the spectrum. One of these days, the color's going to repeat. It's the color, but it never repeated itself.
It never happened. So I want to thank Karina for that. So, and I want to thank you again, Jose. This has been a tremendous.
Al contrario, señor. Al contrario. Thank you. I look forward to the work that we're going to do, but I look forward to the work that is going to build on this work at a different pace, of course, but absolutely. And absolutely, I got caught up in the moment, and absolutely, people have sent me messages, and I've responded by way of, individual messages to people. And Garay is one of them. Martin Serre, I believe, is another one.
Martin, thanks to Martin.
Yeah, Martin Serre is another one. Did I say Garay? And then there's San Carena also. Thank you so much. Absolutely. And there's other people, of course. Other people, I can't see the comments on my screen, so I don't know who's, but I always do my very best to send messages back to people and to thank them. So absolutely. And yes, absolutely, Dust. Thank you so much. I appreciate the fact that you've been loading these conversations on your YouTube page. Folks, I urge you to like Dust's Anti-Imperialist America YouTube page. He has very interesting conversations with a whole variety of people from around the various regions of the English-speaking world, and even from places in the world that I would say rightfully butcher the English language. Rightfully butcher and modify and make it their own. They also are present in Dust's conversations with people. But anyway, thank you so much. We'll be in touch. All right. Gracias, señor. Gracias.